On the corner where Half Moon Lane meets Norwood Road, in the South London district of Herne Hill, stands a building that looks, at first glance, like something transported from an Elizabethan country manor. Red brick rises in ornate patterns beneath steep gables. Terracotta decorations cluster around windows that catch the afternoon light. Victorian mosaic tiles spell out words barely legible now, after more than a century of London weather. The entrance, marked by classical columns supporting a small portico, suggests grandeur from another age. Inside, through doors that have swung open for paying customers since the reign of King Charles II, 6 separate bars spread across the ground floor. Back-painted mirrors depicting waterbirds glow softly in the gaslight-style electric fixtures. Original wooden panelling frames the servery, where generations of barmaids and barmen have pulled pints. 4 iron columns with Corinthian capitals hold up the floors above. This is the Half Moon, a Grade 2-star listed public house, and if you believe the official narratives, the architectural histories, and the heritage plaques, it is a success story. A Victorian pub that survived when thousands of its contemporaries were demolished. A building restored by community action after a devastating flood. A beloved local landmark where U2 played to 12 people in 1980 and got signed to Island Records as a result. But that is only the surface. The Half Moon is also a chronicle of who pays for beauty, who profits from leisure, and whose labour disappears from the official record. This is the story of a pub that cost £64,000 when a family home cost less than £1,000. A place where a barmaid named Edith Smith worked in 6 separate bars designed to keep the working poor away from their social betters. Where a barman named Joseph Kemp fell over the banisters going to his bedroom above the pub and died within seconds of being picked up. Where Charles Booth, the great surveyor of London poverty, stood in 1899 and heard a policeman say it could never pay. Where temperance reformers and brewery companies fought a decades-long war over licensing laws that would determine whether the working man could have his pint after a 12-hour shift. The Half Moon has stood on this corner in various forms since approximately 1650. The current structure went up in 1896 during the greatest pub-building boom Britain ever witnessed, when brewery companies competed to construct ever more elaborate drinking palaces to capture market share in a trade that was simultaneously expanding and coming under fierce moral attack. To understand what the Half Moon really represents requires understanding that double movement: expansion and assault, investment and restriction. A trade that employed tens of thousands while social reformers campaigned to destroy it. And beneath everything, always, the question of who did the actual work, under what conditions, for what compensation, while the building itself became famous for its architecture. The first documented inn at this location was built by a man named Joseph Miller in 1760. Before that, records suggest a licensed premises of some kind occupied the site from around 1650, serving travellers on the old road from London Bridge South to the rural estates of Dulwich. The area took its name, most likely, from the herons that frequented the River Effra, which in the 17th and 18th centuries still flowed openly through the district before Victorian engineers buried it in culverts beneath the expanding streets. In those early centuries, Herne Hill was genuinely rural. Fields stretched in every direction. The road that passed the Half Moon was unpaved, turning to mud in winter and dust in summer. Travellers stopped at the inn to rest horses, take refreshment, and break journeys that, by modern standards, seem impossibly short. but which on foot or in a coach on rutted tracks could take half a day. The pub served the needs of agricultural workers, farmers bringing produce to London markets, and the handful of wealthy families who maintained country estates within riding distance of the city. This was a working inn in a working landscape, and it remained that way for more than a century. By the early 1800s, the area was beginning its slow transformation. In 1805, during the Napoleonic Wars, British Army units conducted training exercises in the fields adjacent to the Half Moon, suggesting the presence of open land large enough for military manoeuvres even as London itself continued to grow. The monthly magazine recorded a small tragedy at the pub in March 1808. A boy chimney sweep died on the 12th of February that year, one of countless children who perished in the brutal trade that would eventually become a rallying point for Victorian reformers. The boy's name, like the names of so many who died young and poor in Georgian England, has disappeared from the record. What survives is the fact of his death at the Half Moon, noted in a magazine article and then forgotten. One more invisible casualty of a system that burned through human lives as casually as it burned coal. In 1824, a man named John Webb took over the tenancy of the Half Moon public house from the Dulwich College estate, which owned the freehold. Parliamentary papers from 1835 document that Webb held a 22-year lease from that date, covering not just the pub building itself, but also a stable and paddock that served the coaching trade. The Webb family would maintain their connection to the Half Moon for what contemporary accounts describe as the best part of a century, becoming one of those dynasties of publicans whose names appear repeatedly in local records, court documents, and census returns. John Webb was not simply a landlord who pulled pints. He was a figure of standing in the community, a man whose word carried weight. In 1833, he appeared at the Old Bailey to provide a character reference for William Patten, accused of stealing a pig. Webb testified to Patten's generally good character. The jury convicted Patten anyway, and he was transported to Australia for 7 years. 20 years later, in 1853, William John Webb, almost certainly John's son, appeared at the Old Bailey again, this time as a witness in the case of Daniel Allen, charged with forgery. Allen received 10 years transportation. These court appearances, preserved in the digitised Old Bailey proceedings, reveal how publicans functioned within their communities. They witnessed contracts, provided references, testified about character and reputation. The pub was not just a drinking establishment, it was a social institution, and the publican was, in many ways, the hub around which local life revolved. The 1851 census recorded that Mr. Webb employed 5 staff members at the Half Moon. 5 people to run a rural pub might seem excessive by modern standards, but the work was considerable. Beer barrels had to be hauled from deliveries, tapped, and kept in good condition. The bar required constant attendance during opening hours, which in the mid-19th century could extend from early morning until late at night, with only brief mandatory closures. Meals had to be prepared for travellers, rooms had to be cleaned if the inn offered accommodation. The stable demanded daily mucking out, feeding and care of horses. The tea gardens that would later make the Half Moon famous required tending. Fires needed constant stoking in winter. Washing was endless. 5 staff members likely worked from dawn until long after dark, 6 or 7 days each week, for wages that left little margin above subsistence. Their names do not appear in most historical accounts. What appears is John Webb's name, the publican, the visible face of the operation, while those who did the heaviest work remain as anonymous as the chimney sweep, who died there 43 years earlier. By 1868, when the property was advertised for sale, the Half Moon had expanded considerably from its 18th century origins. Contemporary advertisements described a substantial establishment comprising 4 rooms on the top floor, an assembly room and 6 additional rooms on the first floor, and a bar with 6 more rooms at ground level. The tea garden had become famous among working-class Londoners as a destination for Sunday excursions. There was a range of stabling that was sublet for £32 per annum. The lease from Dulwich College had 28 years unexpired at £95 annual ground rent. For comparison, a skilled tradesman in London at this time might earn between 30 and 50 shillings per week, roughly £80 to £130 per year. The ground rent alone consumed a significant portion of potential income before accounting for staff wages, maintenance, stock purchases, and all other operating costs. An 1878 newspaper described the Half Moon as a favourite resort for the working men of London, celebrated for its flower gardens, lawns and tea gardens. This reputation as a destination for working-class leisure would prove both an asset and a liability. It brought customers. It also brought scrutiny from temperance reformers who viewed working-class drinking as a social evil requiring legislative suppression. A curious incident in 1844 suggests how the pub functioned within local folklore and antiquarian interest. Workers discovered an ancient tombstone in the pub's skittle ground, believed by some to belong to Edward Allen, the Elizabethan actor who founded Dulwich College in 1619. The stone was apparently being used to assist with sewer drainage, a prosaic fate for what might have been a significant historical artifact. Local legend held that the discovery attracted increased custom to the pub, early evidence of what we might now call heritage tourism. Whether the stone actually belonged to Allen is unknowable. What matters is that the story spread, people came to see, and the Half Moon benefited from the attention. This pattern would repeat throughout the pub's history. Controversy, celebrity, and historical interest all translated into custom, into bodies through the door, into coins across the bar. In the late 19th century, Herne Hill was transforming from a rural village into a London suburb. The catalyst was the railway. Herne Hill Station opened on the 25th of August 1862 as part of the London, Chatham and Dover Railway. The station was designed by architect John Taylor and engineers Joseph Cubitt and J.T. Turner. The Building News in 1863 praised the viaduct as one of the most ornamental pieces of railway work they had ever seen attempted. The architectural excellence of the station mattered because railway companies in the Victorian era understood that infrastructure made statements about progress, modernity, and permanence. An ornamental viaduct announced that this was not temporary construction, but a lasting commitment to the area's development. The impact on Herne Hill was immediate and profound. An 1870 travel guide noted the population at just 701. Within 2 decades, subsequent building had added approximately 3,000 residents. The railway encouraged the construction of smaller houses for clerks, artisans, craftsmen, and their families who took advantage of cheap fares to commute into London for work. By 1869, Herne Hill offered direct rail services to Victoria, the City, King's Cross, Kingston via Wimbledon, and express trains to Dover Harbour for continental Europe, covering 74 miles in 1 hour and 36 minutes. This railway-driven suburban development created a more complex social geography. The upper streets, including Half Moon Lane, Stradella Road, Winterbrook Road, and Burbage Road, retained large Victorian villas with spacious grounds occupied by professional and merchant class families. The lower streets, including Milkwood Road, Loudon Road, and Railton Road, saw the construction of terraced housing by the Suburban Village and General Dwellings Company for clerks, artisans, railway workers, and skilled tradesmen. The Half Moon sat at the boundary between these worlds. Its position at the terminus of horse-drawn omnibus services into London made it a natural gathering point where different classes might rub shoulders, though, as we shall see, the pub's internal architecture was specifically designed to keep them separated even while under the same roof. The area's transformation accelerated through the 1880s and 90s. Ruskin Park, named for the Victorian art critic John Ruskin, who grew up nearby at 28 Herne Hill, would not open until 1907, but the land was being assembled and the plans debated throughout the previous decade. The Carnegie Public Library on Herne Hill Road, funded by Andrew Carnegie's £12,500 grant, would open on the 9th of July 1906 at a total cost of £11,316. These were the years when suburban South London acquired its characteristic Victorian institutional architecture: libraries, churches, schools, parks, and of course public houses. It was in this context, in the mid-1890s, that the Dulwich estate decided to completely rebuild the Half Moon. The precise reasons for this decision are not fully documented in surviving records, but several factors likely contributed. The old pub, despite expansions and modifications over more than a century, was by 1890 becoming visibly outdated. Newer pubs in surrounding areas were being built to modern standards with superior facilities. The great pub building boom of 1880 to 1906 saw brewery companies and pub owners competing to construct ever more impressive establishments to capture market share. A pub that looked old-fashioned risked losing custom to newer competitors. At the same time, the tied house system was becoming increasingly dominant in the brewing industry. Brewery companies were buying up pubs and tying them contractually to sell only their products, transforming independent publicans into tenants who paid reduced rents in exchange for exclusivity. The Dulwich estate, as a charitable educational trust managing property for the benefit of Dulwich College and associated schools, would have been keenly aware of the commercial advantages of a modern, impressive pub that could command higher rents and attract a better class of tenant. The commission to design the new Half Moon went to James William Brooker, Fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects. Brooker, born in 1853, had been articled to architect Henry Jarvis in 1867 at the remarkably young age of 14. He established his own architectural practice in 1873 when he was just 20 years old, becoming an associate of the RIBA in 1887 and achieving full fellowship status shortly thereafter. Brooker lived locally in East Dulwich and specialised in public house design during the peak years of the pub building boom. His portfolio included some of London's most notable Victorian and Edwardian pubs: the Yorkshire Grey on Theobald's Road, the Coach and Horses in Clerkenwell, the Pride of Devonshire in Balham, the Spanish Arms on Lower Marsh, and the Hop Pole in Hammersmith. Several of these buildings have since been designated as listed buildings, testament to Brooker's skill in creating pubs that were both commercially functional and architecturally distinguished. For the Half Moon, Brooker chose the Jacobean Revival style, an architectural vocabulary that combined elements of Elizabethan and Jacobean design with modern Victorian building technology and commercial pub planning. The result was a building that looked backward to an idealised English past while serving the thoroughly modern purposes of the late Victorian drinks trade. The demolition of the old Half Moon was controversial. The picturesque building with its low ceilings and quaint gables had become familiar to generations of Londoners. The satirical magazine Punch published a poem in 1896 entitled "The Doom of Dulwich," lamenting the loss. The crown and the half moon are gone, the poem mourned, recording the destruction of old landmarks in the name of progress. Journalist Alfred Allison wrote in May 1896 that the picturesque old half moon at Herne Hill had been given over to the wreckers and that not a brick or plank remained. In its place had grown up a gigantic modern structure, quite in keeping with the new surroundings. That phrase, quite in keeping with the new surroundings, captures the ambivalence of the moment. The new building was modern, impressive, architecturally accomplished. It was also undeniably the erasure of something older, something that had served the community for more than a century, something that connected the present to a deeper past. Construction of the new Half Moon took place between 1894 and 1896. The building that rose during those 2 years was constructed in red brick with extensive terracotta and carved stone ornamentation. The corner position was exploited to create a prominent street presence with a projecting portico supported by classical columns marking the original hotel entrance. Victorian mosaic tilework spelled out the Half Moon Hotel, a name that emphasised the establishment's aspiration to be more than just a pub, to offer accommodation and dining alongside drink. Large windows with elaborate masonry surrounds flooded the interior with light, a marked contrast to the smaller windows typical of older pubs. Ornate gables echoed the Jacobean country house tradition that gave the style its name. The whole composition was, as the architectural historian Nicholas Pevsner would later write, a cheerful corner pub of 1896, and the proliferation of ornament across the surface gave the building what historic England's listing entry calls a sense of vital unity through sheer number. The workers who built this ornate structure remain largely anonymous. Unlike the architects and owners whose names appear in building records, commercial directories, and newspaper accounts, the bricklayers, carpenters, plasterers, and labourers who did the actual construction work left few traces in the archive. This is the familiar pattern. Buildings are credited to architects and paid for by owners. The hundreds of hours of skilled and unskilled labour that transform architectural drawings into physical structures vanish from the official history. We know that the work took approximately 2 years. We know that the construction required significant quantities of red brick, terracotta ornaments that were likely manufactured off-site and installed by specialised workers, carved stone details that demanded mason skills, timber for floors and roof framing, slate for roofing, glass for the large windows, decorative metalwork, and all the other materials of late Victorian commercial construction. We can estimate that dozens of workers were employed at the peak of construction. We can assume, based on typical Victorian building practices, that they worked 6-day weeks with only Sunday off, that they started at first light and finished at dusk, that the work was physically demanding and frequently dangerous. Falls from scaffolding, injuries from heavy materials, exposure to weather, all were routine hazards of the building trade. But their names, their wages, the specific conditions under which they worked, all of this has disappeared. What we do know is that when the new Half Moon opened for business in 1896, it represented a significant increase in scale and pretension from what had come before. The building contained, according to testimony given 12 years later, 6 separate bars. This multiple bar arrangement was characteristic of late Victorian pub planning and reflected the rigid social stratification of the era. Different bars served different clientele at different prices. The public bar at the front of the building would have been the largest and plainest space with minimal decoration and the cheapest prices. This was where working men, labourers, porters, and others of limited means could afford to drink. The furnishings would have been functional rather than comfortable. Sawdust on the floor was common to absorb spilled beer and make cleaning easier. Seating might be minimal, with many customers standing at the bar. The saloon bar, by contrast, offered superior surroundings for those willing to pay an extra penny per pint. Upholstered seating, better lighting, more elaborate decoration, and a generally more respectable atmosphere attracted lower middle-class clerks, shopkeepers, and better-paid artisans. Other specialised bars might include a private bar for those seeking discretion, a ladies' bar where women could drink without being exposed to the public bar's rough atmosphere, and possibly a jug and bottle department where customers could purchase beer for consumption at home. This spatial segregation served multiple purposes. It allowed a single establishment to capture custom across class boundaries while maintaining the social distances that Victorian and Edwardian society considered proper. A clerk in the saloon bar could feel superior to the labourer in the public bar, even though both were drinking in the same building. The publican benefited by maximising revenue per square foot, charging different prices in different spaces for essentially the same product. The system also managed potential conflicts. Keeping different classes physically separated reduced the likelihood of confrontations that might disrupt trade or attract police attention. The architecture of the pub, in other words, was the architecture of class society made visible in wood and glass partitions, in separate entrances and distinct decoration schemes, in the subtle hierarchies of who could drink where and at what price. The Half Moon's opening in 1896 coincided with what would prove to be the peak years of pub prosperity before the First World War brought dramatic changes. The trade was expanding rapidly. Per capita beer consumption in Britain remained high. Working hours were long and working conditions often grim, making the pub an important site of leisure and social contact for working-class men. At the same time, the temperance movement was gathering strength. The regulatory environment was becoming more hostile, and the long-term trends that would eventually reduce the number of licensed premises in Britain were already beginning to take shape. The Half Moon opened into this contradictory moment, a new pub in a booming trade that was simultaneously under fierce attack from social reformers who viewed the working-class pub as a source of poverty, crime, domestic violence, and moral degradation. In 1897, just 1 year after the rebuilt Half Moon opened, a man named Thomas Casson purchased the property for the extraordinary sum of £64,000. To understand how extraordinary this figure was requires comparison with other property values of the era. Houses in neighbouring Stradella Road, substantial Victorian villas that would house prosperous middle-class families sold for less than £1,000 each. The Half Moon's purchase price was equivalent to more than 65 such family homes. Why would anyone pay such an inflated sum for a public house? The answer lies in the economics of the tied house system and the pub building boom. Brewery companies and pub owners in the late Victorian period were engaged in an arms race to control licensed premises. A pub license was a valuable commodity because the number of licenses was limited by magistrates. Owning a well-located pub in a growing suburban area with a large working-class population represented a secure long-term investment. The building itself was impressive and modern. The location at the junction of multiple roads and at the terminus of omnibus routes ensured steady foot traffic. The name recognition of the Half Moon, which had operated on this site for more than 2 centuries, meant established custom. A buyer might reasonably expect that the £64,000 investment would generate reliable returns through annual profits from beer sales, room rentals, and other services. Thomas Kaysen, however, rapidly discovered that his investment was not performing as expected. Within 18 months of purchase, he had initiated legal proceedings against the vendor, William Arthur Hine, for misrepresentation regarding the pub's trading figures. The case of Kaysen versus Hine reached court in August 1898. Kaysen alleged that the actual takings fell far short of what had been represented to him prior to purchase. The court heard detailed evidence about the pub's financial performance, the representations made during negotiations, and the changes Kaysen had implemented after taking ownership. The verdict went against Kaysen. The court found that he had made operational decisions that explained the revenue decline. He had replaced the existing staff, discontinued the cheap workmen's dinners that had built loyal custom among local labourers, and relocated a Freemasons' lodge that had been meeting at the premises and spending money on food and drink. In other words, Kaysen had paid an inflated price for a going concern and then changed the very things that had made it a going concern in the first place. The case reveals several things about the Half Moon's operations in the late 1890s. First, the pub had been offering cheap meals for working men, an important service in an era when many working-class families lacked adequate cooking facilities at home, and when long working hours made it difficult for wives to prepare elaborate midday meals. These workmen's dinners might cost 6pence or a shilling and would provide substantial quantities of meat, potatoes, vegetables, and bread. The profit margin on food was small, but the meals brought customers who would also purchase beer and the regular custom-built loyalty. Second, the pub hosted a Freemasons' lodge, one of the countless ways that Victorian and Edwardian pubs functioned as community meeting spaces. Friendly societies, trade unions, political clubs, sports clubs, and fraternal organisations all used pub rooms for meetings, often providing significant supplementary income for publicans. Third, the existing staff had relationships with regular customers that contributed to the pub's commercial success. Replacing experienced staff with new employees unfamiliar with the regulars and their preferences disrupted these relationships and drove some custom elsewhere. In December 1899, the social reformer Charles Booth visited Herne Hill as part of his monumental survey of London poverty and working conditions. Booth walked the streets with Police Constable Jones, a local officer who knew the area intimately, and recorded his observations in notebooks now preserved at the London School of Economics Library. Booth described the Half Moon as an elaborate, florid, large, newly decorated public house and noted that it had sold a year or so ago for £64,000. His walking companion, P.C. Jones, expressed scepticism about the investment. "Jones does not think it can pay," Booth recorded. This police officer's doubt reflected a broader concern about over-investment in pub property during the building boom. Prices were rising to levels that made financial sense only if beer consumption continued to grow and if the regulatory environment remained favourable to the trade. Both assumptions would prove questionable in the years ahead. The detailed interior layout of the Half Moon during the Edwardian period is documented in testimony given at the Old Bailey on the 20th of October 1908. Edith Smith, a barmaid employed at the Half Moon Hotel, Herne Hill, appeared as a witness in a case involving counterfeit coinage. Her evidence provides an invaluable snapshot of the pub's daily operations and physical arrangement. Smith described the Half Moon as a large house containing 6 bars. She usually served in the saloon bar, suggesting that this was a superior position requiring more experience or offering better tips than work in the public bar. The front bar, she testified, was quite open without screens. This openness represented a departure from earlier Victorian pub design, where elaborate wooden and glass partitions had subdivided spaces into small compartments. The trend in the 1890s toward larger, more open public bars reflected changing commercial calculations. Larger spaces were easier to supervise, required fewer staff to serve, and created a more convivial atmosphere that might encourage customers to stay longer and drink more. Smith's testimony establishes that a glass of ale and a screw of tobacco cost 2 pence at the Half Moon. A screw was a small paper twist of loose tobacco for rolling cigarettes. 2 pence for beer and tobacco together represents roughly 1/10 of a working man's daily wage, a not inconsiderable expense, but one that fit within the budget of a regularly employed labourer. The pub employed a cash register, a relatively modern piece of technology that had only become standard in British retail during the 1890s. Cash registers helped prevent employee theft by creating a record of transactions and making it more difficult for staff to pocket money. They also provided owners with better data about sales patterns, peak trading times, and which products were most profitable. Smith noted that the pub was never busy in the afternoon. This pattern was typical of Edwardian pubs. Morning trade began early, serving workers on their way to jobs that often started at 6 or 7 in the morning. Trade would tail off by mid-morning, remain quiet through the afternoon, and then surge again in the evening when workers finished their shifts. Saturday nights were the busiest period, when weekly wages were paid and working men had money to spend. The physical features Smith described survive today and can be verified by visiting the Half Moon. The L-shaped servery, with its original panelled counter and bar back, demonstrates the efficient circulation patterns that allowed a small staff to serve multiple bars from a central position. 4 iron columns with Corinthian-style capitals support the upper floors while creating the open public bar space Smith described. These structural elements are both functional and decorative, industrial ironwork dressed in classical vocabulary to elevate the pub's aesthetic pretensions. The snug bar in the rear left of the ground floor contains the Half Moon's most celebrated decorative feature, 6 back-painted mirrors depicting birds in watery surroundings. These extraordinary panels are signed by W. Gibbs and Sons of Blackfriars, one of the most prestigious decorative glass companies of the Victorian era. The technique involves painting on the reverse side of glass, protecting the image from wear while creating a luminous jewel-like quality. Camera, the campaign for Real Ale, describes these as perhaps the best back-painted mirrors in London. Other surviving original features include panelling, coloured glass, etched mirrors, and 2 decorative screens incorporating etched, cut, and coloured glass with lozenge designs depicting barley, hops and foliage, the traditional iconography of the brewing trade. These decorative elements were not merely ornamental, they served several commercial and social functions. The elaborate glasswork signalled that this was a superior establishment worth patronising. The botanical imagery linked the pub to the agricultural origins of beer, suggesting wholesomeness and tradition. The screens and mirrors made the space feel larger and more opulent through reflection and refraction of light, and the sheer craft skill on display in the etched and painted glass marked the half moon as a cut above ordinary beer houses. In an era when working-class leisure options were limited and often grim, the pub offered an alternative. For the price of a pint, a working man could spend time in surroundings more comfortable and attractive than his own home, which might be overcrowded, poorly lit, inadequately heated, and lacking in any decorative amenity. The pub's beauty was part of what it sold. Behind this beauty, of course, lay labour. Edith Smith's work as a barmaid placed her in an occupation that attracted considerable social concern during the Edwardian period. An estimated 20,000 barmaids worked in Britain at the time. Most lived in at pub premises, just as Joseph Kemp, the barman who fell over the banisters at the Half Moon in 1907 and died within seconds, lived in. Government investigator Eliza Orme conducted a major inquiry into barmaid working conditions, interviewing nearly 300 people. Her findings established that barmaids and shop girls' combined weekly earnings averaged around £2 and 6 shillings, or approximately 11 to 12 shillings per person per week. This was significantly less than the wages of a male barman, who might earn £1 or more per week. Women were employed because they were cheaper than male staff. The phrase appears again and again in contemporary accounts. Brewery companies and publicans hired barmaids not because of any inherent superiority in their service, but because they could pay them less. Living in conditions were often cramped and uncomfortable. The barmaid's room would typically be a small space in the upper floors or attic of the pub, furnished with a narrow bed, a washstand, perhaps a small wardrobe or chest of drawers. Privacy was minimal. The room might be shared with other female staff. Noise from the bars below could make sleep difficult, particularly on busy weekend nights when the pub might not close until well after midnight. Working hours were long, often 12 to 14 hours per day, 6 days per week. The work was physically demanding. Barrels of beer weighed hundreds of pounds and had to be manhandled into position and tapped. Glass had to be washed constantly by hand. Floors required sweeping and mopping multiple times daily. Customers could be difficult, demanding, sometimes drunk and aggressive. Barmaids were expected to be pleasant, attractive, and flirtatious enough to encourage custom, but respectable enough to maintain the pub's reputation. The balance was precarious. A barmaid who was too friendly risked her reputation and might face unwanted advances. One who was too cold might lose tips or be accused of discouraging trade. Reformers in the temperance movement expressed particular concern about barmaids, viewing them as victims of a corrupt trade. Some argued that barmaids were exposed to moral danger from drunken male customers and that no respectable woman should work in such an environment. Others contended that the presence of attractive young women behind the bar was a deliberate strategy to lure men into drinking more than they otherwise would. The 1908 licensing bill attempted to ban the employment of women in pubs entirely, a move that provoked fierce opposition. The Barmaids Political Defence League mobilised to protect women's employment rights, arguing that barmaids were working women trying to support themselves or their families, and that destroying their occupation in the name of protecting them was hypocritical and cruel. 500,000 people protested in Hyde Park in September 1908 against the licensing bill. The House of Lords ultimately rejected the legislation. Barmaids like Edith Smith kept their jobs, though the political battle demonstrated how working-class women's labour was constantly vulnerable to middle-class reform campaigns driven more by class prejudice than genuine concern for workers' welfare. The death of Joseph Kemp in 1907 illustrates the physical risks of pub work beyond the obvious concerns about alcohol exposure or moral corruption that preoccupied reformers. Kemp's fatal fall over the banisters while going to his bedroom revealed how pub staff navigated the same building that housed both commercial and residential functions. Victorian and Edwardian pubs typically had separate staircases for family and staff, distinct from customer areas. These stairs were often narrow, steep, poorly lit, and potentially dangerous, particularly late at night when tired workers climbed them after long shifts. Kemp's death was reported in multiple newspapers, including the Jersey Independent and Daily Telegraph on the 7th of September 1907, and the Sunderland Daily Echo, Western Daily Press, and Surrey Mirror. The coverage indicates that his death was considered newsworthy, perhaps because fatal accidents at well-known pubs were relatively unusual, or because the circumstances, falling over banisters, had a dramatic quality that interested readers. But the reporting was brief. No inquest testimony appears in the archive. No details about Kemp's age, experience, or family survive. He was a barman who fell and died. The pub remained open. Life and trade continued. To understand the world that Edith Smith and Joseph Kemp inhabited requires understanding the broader economic and social landscape of Edwardian Herne Hill. Census data from the Peabody estate at Rosendale Road, opened around 1902 within walking distance of the Half Moon, provides detailed evidence about working-class life in the neighbourhood. The Peabody Trust, a charitable organisation founded by American banker George Peabody in 1862, constructed model dwellings for the respectable working poor. Applicants for Peabody housing had to meet strict criteria. They needed regular employment, good character references, and weekly wages below a ceiling set at 30 shillings. The average tenant at the Herne Hill estate earned around 22 shillings per week. Typical occupations included gardeners, motor omnibus conductors, labourers, porters, shop assistants, and railway workers. Families were large, with up to 8 children being common. Children left school and began work at age 13 to contribute to family income. These families lived in flats of 1, 2, or 3 rooms, paying weekly rents of approximately 4 to 7 shillings. For a family surviving on 22 shillings per week, every expenditure required calculation. Rent consumed perhaps 30% of income. Food for a large family took most of the remainder. Coal for heating and cooking, clothing, boots, medicine, all these necessities competed for limited resources. There was virtually no margin for unexpected expenses. Illness, unemployment, accident, any disruption to the wage earner's ability to work could push a family from poverty to destitution. In this context, the pub served functions that transcended simple leisure. For working men living in crowded flats with inadequate heating, no privacy, and few amenities, the pub offered warmth, light, and space. For 2p, a man could spend an hour or two in comfortable surroundings, perhaps read a newspaper provided by the house, engage in conversation with workmates or neighbours, and escape, temporarily, the pressures of home and work. The pub functioned as what some historians have called the working man's club, an essential social institution in communities that lacked other leisure facilities. The Half Moon's position at the boundary between Herne Hill's middle class and working class districts meant it attracted custom from both populations, though they were carefully segregated within the building. Middle-class customers in the saloon bar might include clerks from the city who commuted via Herne Hill station, shopkeepers from the local commercial streets, lower-level professionals like bookkeepers or commercial travellers, and members of the skilled artisan class who considered themselves a cut above ordinary labourers. These customers paid an extra penny per pint for the superior surroundings, but would have been horrified at the suggestion that they were the same as the labourers in the public bar. Victorian and Edwardian class consciousness operated at a granular level. Small differences in income, occupation, education, dress and manner carried enormous social significance. The pub's architecture acknowledged and reinforced these distinctions. The regulatory environment in which the Half Moon operated became increasingly hostile during the Edwardian period. The temperance movement, which had grown from evangelical Christian origins in the early 19th century into a mass political movement by the turn of the 20th century, achieved its greatest legislative success with the Licensing Act of 1904. The Act was introduced by the Conservative government of Prime Minister Arthur Balfour and represented a compromise between the temperance campaigners who wanted prohibition and the brewing industry that fought to preserve the trade. Under the new law, magistrates received power to refuse licence renewals if a pub was deemed unnecessary to provide for the needs of the public. A compensation scheme was established to provide financial settlement for publicans and property owners whose licences were revoked. The compensation funds came from levies imposed on surviving licensed premises, meaning that pub owners were effectively being forced to pay for the closure of their competitors. The distribution of compensation typically allocated approximately 10% to the licensee who lost their living and 90% to the property owner who lost rental income. Between 1904 and the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, over 1,000 licenses were lost in Birmingham alone. Nationally, thousands of pubs closed. The criteria for determining which premises were unnecessary were often arbitrary and reflected class prejudices as much as objective assessment of need. Pubs in working-class districts were more vulnerable than those in middle-class areas. Beer houses, which sold only beer and held a cheaper license, faced higher closure rates than full licensed premises that could sell spirits and wine. Small old-fashioned pubs were more likely to lose their licenses than modern impressive establishments like the Half Moon. The whole system created an economic dynamic that favoured consolidation and grandeur. Brewery companies invested heavily in rebuilding and improving premises, calculating that an impressive modern pub would be more likely to retain its license under the new regulatory regime. The pub building boom of 1880 to 1906 was driven partly by competition for market share, but also partly by defensive strategy against temperance regulation. The Liberal government elected in the 1906 landslide victory attempted to push regulation further. The 1908 licensing bill proposed closure of 1/3 of all public houses in England and Wales, approximately 30,000 of 96,000 premises. Sunday opening hours would be reduced from 6 hours to 3 hours. Most controversially, the bill proposed a complete ban on the employment of women as barmaids. The response was immediate and massive. 500,000 people protested in Hyde Park in September 1908. The Barmaids' Political Defence League, formed to protect women's employment, argued that the proposal would destroy the livelihoods of 20,000 women and their dependents. Brewery companies mobilised against the bill. Conservative politicians attacked it as government overreach and an assault on working-class leisure. The House of Lords, then still possessing full veto power over legislation, rejected the bill. The status quo established by the 1904 Act remained in place. This legislative battle illuminates the class tensions underlying the temperance campaign. The movement was dominated by middle-class reformers, often with evangelical Christian backgrounds, who viewed working-class drinking habits with a mixture of concern and contempt. Rooted in values of self-control, delayed gratification, and rational management of resources, the temperance ideology reflected middle-class assumptions about proper behaviour. Working-class men who spent evenings in pubs rather than at home with their families, who consumed a significant portion of their wages on beer, who sometimes became drunk and disorderly, appeared from this perspective to be victims of a trade that exploited their weaknesses. The solution, temperance advocates argued, was to reduce access to alcohol by closing pubs, restricting opening hours, and creating alternative leisure facilities such as parks, libraries, and temperance halls where working men could spend their free time in morally improving ways. Working-class responses to temperance varied. Some embraced temperance Chartism from 1838 onward, linking abstinence to political respectability and arguing that sobriety would make the working class more effective in demanding political rights. Friendly societies and some trade unions promoted temperance among their members. The Band of Hope, founded in Leeds in 1847, enlisted hundreds of thousands of working-class children in pledges of lifelong abstinence. At the same time, many working-class people resented temperance campaigns as hypocritical. Middle-class critics of working-class beer drinking often consumed wine and spirits in their own homes. The pub served functions in working-class communities that middle-class reformers failed to understand or value. It was a site of sociability, a place where workers could discuss grievances that might lead to union organisation, a venue for friendly societies and mutual aid organisations, a commercial hub where informal employment networks operated. The phrase "the working man's club" captures this complex reality. The pub was not simply a place of drinking, it was a social institution embedded in the fabric of working-class life. The economic arguments against temperance regulation were also contested along class lines. Brewers and publicans argued that the trade provided employment for hundreds of thousands of people, generated substantial tax revenue, and represented billions of pounds in legitimate private property that would be destroyed by prohibition. Temperance advocates countered that the costs of drinking, including poverty, crime, domestic violence, workplace accidents, and medical expenses, exceeded any economic benefits. Academic economists studied the question without reaching consensus. What was clear was that both sides deployed economic arguments to advance positions rooted fundamentally in moral and social visions of how society should be organised. The operating hours permitted under Edwardian licensing laws reveal both the scope of the trade and the incremental nature of regulation. Before First World War restrictions, London pubs could legally open for 20 hours and 30 minutes daily in the Metropolitan Police District. Typical hours ran from 5 o'clock in the morning until midnight. These hours reflected the reality of working-class life. Early morning openings served workers beginning shifts at factories, markets and docks at 6 or 7 in the morning. Beer for breakfast was not unusual. Afternoon opening caught workers on meal breaks. Evening hours were peak trading time when workers finished their shifts. Sunday hours were more restricted, limited to approximately 6 to 7 hours with mandatory closure periods, reflecting Sabbatarian religious influence. Market pubs near Smithfield Borough Market and Covent Garden held special early morning licences to serve market workers whose shifts began in the middle of the night. The Half Moon's 6 bars and hotel licence allowed it to offer a range of services beyond simple drink sales. The hotel designation meant overnight accommodation could be offered, though there is little evidence that this was a major part of the business. Advertising evidence suggests the pub offered luncheons, billiards, and snooker. Surviving stained glass panels reference these games, indicating they were considered important enough to memorialize in permanent decoration. Billiards and snooker required dedicated space, good lighting, and quality tables that represented significant capital investment. They attracted a particular clientele, skilled workers and lower middle-class men who had leisure time during the day and money to spend on games that could take an hour or more. The provision of these facilities diversified the pub's income streams and made it less vulnerable to fluctuations in beer sales alone. Pricing evidence from the Edwardian period establishes that beer remained remarkably affordable by the standards of working-class budgets. Standard mild or ale cost approximately 1 penny per pint. Quality ales might cost 4p per quart, which is to say 1 penny per pint. Edith Smith's testimony that a glass of ale and a screw of tobacco cost 2p at the Half Moon aligns with these prices. A working man earning 22 shillings per week, equal to 264 pennies, could theoretically afford more than 100 pints if he spent his entire wages on beer. Of course, nobody did this. Rent, food, clothing and family needs consumed most income. The typical working-class beer budget might be 6 to 12p per week, allowing 3 to 6 pints, mostly concentrated on Saturday night when wages were paid. These modest expenditures represented, for working-class families, a contested allocation of scarce resources. Wives often resented money spent on beer that might have bought food or clothing for children. Publicans and brewery companies, recognizing this tension, marketed beer as nutritious and wholesome, practically a food rather than simply an intoxicant. David Lloyd, George's budget of 1909 disrupted the price stability that had prevailed since the 1870s. Lloyd George increased beer duty and license fees as part of his controversial People's Budget aimed at funding social welfare programs and naval expansion. Beer prices rose from 4p to 5p per quart, a 25% increase that provoked significant working-class resentment. The price increase contributed to the budget's controversial reception and the constitutional crisis that followed when the House of Lords rejected it. The working-class customers of pubs like the Half Moon faced a choice between drinking less beer, which meant sacrificing one of their few leisure pleasures, or spending more on beer, which meant cutting something else from their already tight budgets. Either way, they paid the cost of progressive taxation, aimed, ironically, at improving working-class welfare. The tied house system that dominated the brewing industry by the Edwardian period shaped the Half Moon's operations in ways that were largely invisible to customers but fundamental to the economics of the trade. Photographic evidence confirms that the Half Moon was tied to Barclay Perkins and Company, the Southwark-based brewery, during the early 20th century. Under a tied house arrangement, the pub agreed to sell only Barclay Perkins products in exchange for financial support that might include reduced rent, loans for improvements, or guaranteed supply of beer at wholesale prices. For the brewery, tied houses guaranteed distribution outlets and market share. For the publican, the tie provided financial security but constrained commercial freedom. If a rival brewery produced better or cheaper beer, the publican could not switch suppliers without breaking the contract. Barclay Perkins was one of London's great brewing dynasties. The company traced its origins to the Anchor Brewery on Bankside, Suffolk, established in the early 18th century. By the Victorian era, Barclay Perkins was one of the largest brewers in Britain, operating vast premises that employed hundreds of workers and produced thousands of barrels daily. The relationship between great breweries like Barclay Perkins and tied houses like the Half Moon was symbiotic but unequal. The brewery possessed capital, industrial capacity, and market power. The publican possessed local knowledge, customer relationships, and the day-to-day operational expertise that kept the beer flowing and the money coming in. The brewery could terminate a tie and find another publican. The publican who lost a tied house might find it difficult to secure another position, particularly if the termination was contentious. The succession of individuals who owned or managed the Half Moon through the early 20th century reflects the precarious nature of the trade. Thomas Kayson, who paid £64,000 in 1897, learned expensive lessons about the gap between trading figures and actual profits. By the early 20th century, the pub was in the hands of Barclay Perkins as a tied house. At some point before 1935, William Nye Songhurst became landlord. Songhurst's tenure ended in the most dramatic possible way on the 4th of March 1935, when he died from shock following the discovery of a burglary at the premises. He was 47 years old. Multiple newspapers reported the incident. The Sunderland Daily Echo, Western Daily Press, and Surrey Mirror all carried the story, indicating that the death of a London publican under unusual circumstances was considered newsworthy across the country. The details are sparse. We know there was a burglary. We know Songhurst discovered it. We know he died shortly afterward from what the newspapers described as shock. Whether the burglars confronted him, whether he died from a heart attack or stroke brought on by the distress, whether there was violence, all of this remains unclear. What is clear is that Songhurst, like Joseph Kemp nearly 30 years earlier, died suddenly in connection with his work at the Half Moon. Running a pub was not a safe occupation. Publicans handled significant amounts of cash. They stayed on the premises with their families. They were vulnerable to theft, assault, and all the risks associated with serving alcohol to strangers who might be desperate, violent, or simply unlucky. Later owners included Dennis Parker, a former chauffeur to Frank Sinatra, though the dates of his tenure are not well documented. In the 1960s and 70s, Bert Hyland held the license. Hyland was a former professional boxer who had won the Irish Middleweight Championship in June 1949. Both men represent the diverse paths through which individuals entered the pub trade. Parker's connection to celebrity, driving for one of the most famous entertainers of the 20th century, gave him stories to tell and perhaps connections that brought interesting customers. Hyland's boxing background gave him both the physical presence useful in managing a pub where violence was always a possibility and the name recognition that might attract fight fans. The Half Moon's most celebrated later incarnation began in the early 1960s when the pub became a music venue. The folk club that operated through the mid-1960s drew large audiences every Tuesday night. Run by Ed Parslow and Charles Pearce, students at Camberwell College of Arts, the club hosted some of the most important figures in the British folk revival. Bert Jansch, whose innovative guitar playing would influence generations of musicians. Diz Disley, the guitarist who would later achieve fame playing with Stefan Grappelli. Dave and Tony Arthur, collectors and performers of traditional songs. Jerry Loughran, Pete and Marion Gray, the Hickory Nuts, and the Bruce Turner Jump Band. These Tuesday night sessions created a scene, a community of musicians and fans who knew they were witnessing something significant, even if they could not have predicted how influential the folk revival would become. The transition from folk club to pub rock venue happened around 1974 when local musician Stevie Smith started Sunday jam sessions. These informal gatherings attracted professional musicians from established bands who wanted to play outside their commercial contexts. Members of the Jeff Beck Group, Rory Gallagher's band, and Thin Lizzy all sat in at various times. The jams built the Half Moon's reputation as a place where serious musicians could play to knowledgeable audiences in an intimate setting. The pub rock movement of the mid-1970s embraced the Half Moon as a key venue. Dr. Feelgood, 9 Below Zero, Eddie and the Hot Rods, and Meal Ticket all played gigs that drew packed crowds and contributed to a musical culture that rejected the corporate excesses of mainstream rock in favour of raw, direct, energetic performances in small spaces. The most historically significant musical event at the Half Moon occurred on the 8th of June 1980, when an Irish band called U2 played to approximately 12 people. Among that tiny audience was Chris Blackwell, founder of Island Records, the label that had already achieved legendary status for signing Bob Marley and the Wailers. Blackwell saw enough potential in U2's performance to attend their return gig on the 11th of July 1980, which sold out. Shortly afterward, he signed U2 to Island Records. The band played a third and final Half Moon gig on the 5th of October 1980 during their Boy Tour. Within a few years, U2 would become one of the biggest bands in the world. Their connection to the Half Moon, playing to handfuls of people in a South London pub before anyone beyond Dublin had heard of them, became part of music history. Other artists who passed through the venue during its nearly 50-year run as a live music space included The Police, Van Morrison, Eric Clapton, The Stray Cats, Billy Bragg, Paloma Faith, Kay Tempest, LaRue, who won a Grammy after starting at Half Moon open mic nights aged 17, and then Jericho, who played their first ever gig at the pub in 1983. This musical heritage made the Half Moon significant beyond its architectural merits or its historical value as an Edwardian pub. The building had hosted performances that shaped British popular music. Hundreds of musicians had sweated through sets on its stage. Thousands of audience members had discovered new artists in its rooms. When disaster struck in August 2013, the threat to the Half Moon mobilised not just local residents concerned about losing their pub, but musicians, music fans, and cultural advocates who recognised that the building mattered in ways that extended far beyond Herne Hill. The disaster came in the form of an 88-year-old water main that burst at 5 o'clock in the morning on the 7th of August 2013. The pipe was 3 feet wide, a major artery in the Thames water network, and when it failed, water surged through surrounding streets at devastating volume. Floodwater reached chest height in some areas. Over 36 properties were affected. The insurance claims eventually totaled approximately £4 million, making it one of the largest flooding incidents in memory. The Half Moon suffered serious basement flooding. The water damaged electrical systems, stock, fixtures and fittings. The pub closed immediately and would remain closed for nearly 4 years, while insurers, freeholders, potential lessees, planners and campaigners fought over its future. The Dulwich estate, as freeholder, faced a choice. The estate is a charitable educational trust managing property to support Dulwich College, Allen School and James Allen's Girls' School. Its responsibility is to maximise income from its property portfolio to fund educational activities. From a purely financial perspective, converting the Half Moon to alternative uses might generate more income than continuing to operate it as a pub. In 2014, the estate proposed converting the upper floors to 5 self-contained flats and building a mews house in the yard. The scheme would have preserved some pub use on the ground floor, but fundamentally altered the building's character and potentially made it unviable as a community venue. Southwark Council's pre-application advice indicated the plans would not succeed. The estate withdrew the proposal. A Save the Half Moon campaign mobilised community opposition to any plans that threatened the pub's future. The campaign collected 7,500 signatures on change.org. Celebrity supporters included comedian Joe Brand, musician LaRue, actor Mark Rylance, and singer Paul Young. Boris Johnson, then Mayor of London, voiced support. The campaign argued that the Half Moon was not just a pub, but a cultural institution with heritage value that extended beyond the building itself. In December 2015, Southwark Council listed the pub as an asset of community value, a designation that provided some protection against conversion to other uses. The Dulwich estate appealed the designation. In April 2016, the appeal was rejected and the asset of community value status upheld. In January 2016, Fuller Smith and Turner plc, the London brewery company known as Fuller's, acquired the lease from the Dulwich estate. Fuller's committed to a full restoration that would preserve the pub's exceptional historic interior while adding 12 boutique hotel bedrooms in the upper floors. The restoration, carried out by contractor Concord BGW, took more than a year. The Half Moon reopened on the 20th of March 2017 after almost 4 years of closure. The restoration earned industry recognition. The pub was a finalist in the Publican Awards for Best New Pub or Bar in 2018. It won the regional winner for London, award in the National Pub and Bar Awards in May 2018. In November 2019, Fuller's awarded the Half Moon its own Griffin Trophy for Best Pub in the Fuller's estate. The reopened Half Moon preserved the Grade 2 star listed interior features that made it architecturally significant. The L-shaped servery with original panelled counter and bar back, the 4 iron columns with Corinthian-style capitals, the snug bar with W. Gibbs and Sons back-painted mirrors, the original panelling, coloured glass, etched mirrors, and decorative screens with hop and barley lozenges. The 12 hotel bedrooms, named after the 12 men who walked on the moon, added a revenue stream that helped make the operation financially viable. The restoration represented a successful partnership between a charitable freeholder seeking appropriate tenants for historic buildings, a brewery company with experience operating heritage pubs, skilled contractors who understood conservation principles, and a community that had fought to save a landmark it valued. But the reopening also revealed tensions between heritage preservation and commercial viability. Despite the Save the Half Moon campaign's emphasis on the building's musical heritage, Southwark Council approved Fuller's plans to remove the legendary music stage and replace it with kitchen and dining facilities. The pub that had hosted U2, The Police, and Van Morrison no longer operates as a regular live music venue. A function room called the Workshop retains some flexibility for occasional entertainment, but the days of weekly gigs and Sunday jam sessions are gone. This decision reflects the economic reality of running a large pub in 21st century London. Food sales generate higher profit margins than drink sales alone. Modern customers expect high-quality food alongside their beer. The demographic that supported pub rock and folk clubs has aged. Younger generations have different leisure patterns. Music licensing costs, sound insulation requirements, and neighbours' complaints about noise make running a regular live music venue legally complex and financially risky. The tension between preserving heritage and adapting to contemporary economic conditions is not unique to the Half Moon. It affects historic pubs across Britain. Thousands have closed in recent decades, unable to generate profits sufficient to justify their continued operation. Those that survive often do so by diversifying into food, accommodation, function hire, and other services beyond traditional drinking. The question for heritage advocates is whether a building that has lost its historic function but retained its historic fabric should be celebrated as a preservation success or mourned as a loss. The Half Moon serves food where musicians once played. Is this adaptation or betrayal? The answer likely depends on your priorities. For those who value architectural heritage and community gathering spaces, the reopened Half Moon represents success. The building survives. It continues to function as a pub. People gather there. For those who valued the music heritage specifically, something precious has been lost that no amount of architectural preservation can replace. Walking into the Half Moon today, what strikes a visitor first is how much survives from James William Brooker's 1896 design and from the interior fittings installed when the pub opened. The mahogany, the mirrors, the etched glass, all of it is still there, polished and preserved, looking much as it would have looked to Edith Smith when she stood behind the bar in 1908. You can stand where she stood. You can see what she saw. The iron columns rise to the ceiling just as they did when Thomas Kaysen discovered his £64,000 investment was not performing as hoped. The back-painted mirrors glow with the same underwater light that would have reflected on Joseph Kemp's face before he climbed the stairs to his bedroom for the last time. The building is a time machine, in a sense, connecting present to past through physical continuity. But what is not visible, what cannot be preserved in glass and wood, is the human world that gave the building meaning. The barmaids who earned 11 shillings per week and lived in cramped rooms above the bars. The barmen who risked their lives on steep dark staircases. The working men who spent precious pennies on beer because the pub offered warmth and company their homes could not provide. The clerks who paid an extra penny per pint for the privilege of drinking in the saloon bar rather than standing shoulder to shoulder with labourers in the public bar. The temperance campaigners who viewed the whole enterprise as a moral evil requiring suppression. The publicans who navigated between brewery demands, magistrate expectations, customer desires, and the daily reality of running a business that was simultaneously profitable and precarious. All of these people are gone. What remains is the shell they inhabited, beautiful and mute, telling only the stories we can reconstruct from fragmentary evidence scattered across archives and memories. The Half Moon's survival is not inevitable or natural. It survives because specific people made specific decisions at specific moments. James William Brooker designed a building of such architectural quality that it was listed Grade 2 star. The Dulwich estate maintained ownership through decades when selling for development might have been more profitable. Thomas Casson, despite his disastrous purchase, kept the pub operating. Successive tenants through the 20th century adapted to changing conditions without destroying the historic fabric. The Save the Half Moon campaign mobilised political and community support at a critical moment when conversion to other uses threatened. Fuller's Brewery committed to restoration rather than minimal refurbishment. Each of these decisions represented a choice to preserve rather than destroy, to adapt rather than abandon, to invest in heritage rather than maximise short-term returns. The question of who paid for the Half Moon and who pays for it now has no single simple answer. The workers who built it in 1894 and 1895 paid with their labour, their injuries, their exposure to weather and accident. They left their skill in the brickwork, the terracotta, the carved stone, the timber framing. Thomas Casson paid £64,000 and learned bitter lessons about the difference between purchase price and profitability. Barclay Perkins paid through decades of tied house support, supplying beer on credit and maintaining the property. The publicans paid through long hours, financial risk, and in William Nye Songhurst's case, with his life. The staff paid through low wages, hard work, and dangerous conditions. The customers paid pint by pint, meal by meal, game of billiards by game of billiards, generating the revenue stream that made everything else possible. The community paid in 2013 through fighting to save the building when it faced conversion. Fuller's Brewery paid for restoration, and today's customers pay premium prices for food and drink that fund ongoing maintenance of a building that costs far more to operate than a modern purpose-built structure would. The cost is not only financial. Heritage preservation requires sacrifice of potential alternative uses. The upper floors could house more residential flats, addressing London's housing shortage. The ground floor could be retail space in an area where shops struggle. The whole site could be redeveloped for maximum density and profit. Choosing to preserve the Half Moon as a pub means accepting that other possibilities will not be realised. Whether this is a wise choice depends on what you value. If you value architectural heritage, historical continuity, and community gathering spaces, preservation makes sense. If you value efficient use of expensive urban land for housing or economic development, preservation looks like sentiment trumping rationality. The temperance reformers who fought against pubs like the Half Moon in the Edwardian period believed sincerely that they were serving working-class interests by reducing access to alcohol. They saw the poverty, domestic violence, and degradation associated with heavy drinking. They witnessed children going hungry while fathers spent wages on beer. They knew publicans and brewery companies profited from working-class weakness. From their perspective, closing pubs would free working people from exploitation and force them toward more wholesome uses of leisure time. That this perspective was rooted in class prejudice and failed to understand the social functions. Pubs served in working-class communities does not mean it was entirely wrong. Alcohol did cause genuine harm. Some pubs were run badly and did exploit customers. The temperance critique contained truth, even if the proposed solution was flawed. The complicated legacy of the Half Moon includes this tension. The building is beautiful, the craftsmanship is superb. The decorative glasswork by W. Gibbs & Sons is museum quality. The architectural composition demonstrates real skill. All of this is true and valuable. It is also true that the building exists because brewery companies in the 1890s were competing to construct elaborate drinking palaces that would capture market share in a trade that generated enormous profits by selling addictive substances to working people who had limited leisure options. The beauty served commercial purposes. The ornament existed to attract customers and make them stay longer and spend more money. The multiple bars were designed to extract maximum revenue from every class level while maintaining the social hierarchies that kept working people divided. Understanding the Half Moon fully requires holding all of these truths simultaneously without resolving them into a simple narrative of either celebration or condemnation. The pub's survival through multiple threats over more than 3 centuries suggests something about its role in the community that transcends its function as a commercial drinking establishment. People fought to save it, not just because it was old or beautiful, but because it mattered to them. It was their pub, the place where they had drunk with friends, heard music, celebrated occasions, marked transitions. The building accumulated meaning through use, through memory, through the countless small interactions that took place within its walls. This accumulated meaning gave people a reason to campaign, to sign petitions, to turn up at planning meetings, to donate to preservation funds. The Half Moon mattered because people decided it mattered. Heritage does not exist in buildings. It exists in the relationship between buildings and people. At the same time, we should not romanticize this relationship or ignore its exclusions. The Half Moon served some people well and others poorly, or not at all. Women, for most of its history, were unwelcome as customers, except in limited circumstances. The ladies' bar, if one existed, would have been a small, uncomfortable space where respectable women could drink discreetly without entering male-dominated areas. Barmaids worked there but faced moral suspicion and sexual harassment. Children were excluded entirely, and rightly so, but this meant the pub was fundamentally a masculine space organised around male leisure patterns. The working-class men who drank in the public bar might have felt ownership of the space, but they were also carefully segregated from their social betters and served beer at prices calculated to extract maximum profit from limited budgets. The clerks in the saloon bar paid for the privilege of not mixing with labourers. Everyone was welcome at the Half Moon, provided they knew their place and could pay the price of entry to their designated zone. These exclusions and hierarchies were not unique to the Half Moon. They characterized Victorian and Edwardian society generally. The pub simply made them visible in spatial form. The persistence of the building today, with its multiple bars still identifiable, even though they now serve unified purposes, preserves this class architecture for contemporary inspection. You can walk through the Half Moon and understand how Victorian class society functioned by reading the different levels of decoration, the varying ceiling heights, the placement of doors and screens. The building is a teaching tool if we choose to read it that way, revealing truths about how power and inequality operated in spaces that claimed to be democratic and open. The story of the Half Moon is the story of London writ small, a medieval hamlet growing into a Victorian suburb growing into a 20th century urban neighbourhood struggling with 21st century pressures of gentrification, development and cultural change. The pub anchored that transformation, adapting to each era while maintaining physical continuity with earlier incarnations. The 1650 inn, the 1760 building, the rebuilt 1896 structure, the restored 2017 pub, all occupy the same corner, serve similar social functions, and bear the same name. This continuity across nearly 4 centuries is rare in London, where development has erased most traces of earlier built environments. The survival of the Half Moon is historically significant, not because it is unique, but because it is exceptional. It demonstrates what was once common, what most neighbourhoods had, and most neighbourhoods lost. If you enjoy investigations into hidden histories of Gilded Age architecture and Edwardian social dynamics, subscribe to this channel and share your thoughts in the comments. Tell me which London buildings hold stories that deserve deeper examination. Your support makes these detailed investigations possible. The Half Moon at Herne Hill stands today as testament to craft, commerce, class conflict, community organising, and survival against odds. Its Grade 2 star listing protects the fabric. Fuller's brewery commitment maintains the operation. The building's beauty attracts customers who may know nothing of its history. But the deeper story, the story of who built it, who worked there, who drank there, who fought for it, and what it all meant, that story requires telling and retelling. Buildings do not speak for themselves. They require interpreters. This has been one interpretation among many possible. The Half Moon deserves all of them. Thank you for listening.